I came down for breakfast and my chair was gone. My daughter sent me to eat in my room in front of my grandkids. I'm Sylvia, 71 years old, former waterfront merchant. I went upstairs for my yellow folder. Today I will charge them every single penny. The smell of fried bacon and black coffee flooded the downstairs hallway. Those aromas were always my weakness. The reward after getting up at 5 in the morning for over 40 years to open my dry goods and spice shop down at the port. However, that Tuesday morning, the aroma felt like a sick joke. The dining room, the nerve center of my house, was occupied. The massive red oak table that I picked out myself and paid for in cash over 2 decades ago looked completely jammed. I stood in the doorway, resting my right hand on the wooden frame. My eyes scanned the room looking for the obvious. My chair, the one that always sat at the head of the table by the window to catch the ocean breeze, had vanished. In its place, the gap had been closed by the other chairs squeezed tightly together to accommodate Marcy's 5 kids. Marcy, my only daughter, had her back to me, pouring coffee into ceramic mugs. The exact same mugs I bought on a trip to New York. She poured 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 mugs. The glass carafe went right back on the stove. There was no mug for me, no plate, no chair. I took a step forward, making the sole of my shoe squeak slightly against the terracotta tile. Marcy turned around, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at me with a mix of annoyance and a rush that expression that had become her default face over the last few months. "Mom, there's no room left," she said in a casual tone, like she was announcing we were out of bread. "The kids have gotten so big, and the table is just too small for us." "I put your plate and your coffee on a tray. Go eat in your room. You'll be more comfortable and quiet up there." The silence that followed her words was deafening. My 5 grandkids were sitting right there. Hunter, the oldest at 19, didn't even look up from his cell phone. His thumbs flew across the screen at lightning speed while he chewed loudly. The 14-year-old twins traded a quick glance and went right back to burying their spoons in their bowls of oatmeal. The 2 youngest girls just kept coloring in a notebook at the corner of the table, entirely oblivious to the cruelty their mother had just spit out. Nobody said a word. Nobody stood up to offer me their seat. Nobody questioned the order. I felt a sudden heat rising up my neck, a fire that had absolutely nothing to do with the humid coastal weather. It was pure, distilled indignation. I looked at the plastic tray Marcy had left on the kitchen counter. It held a plate of scrambled eggs, a couple of pieces of toast, and a half-empty mug of coffee. It looked like a prisoner's ration, or the scraps you leave out for the night watchman down at the docks. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Years in the wholesale business taught me that whoever loses their temper in a negotiation loses the merchandise. And this wasn't just some casual morning disrespect. This was a full-blown eviction. They were wiping me off the map in my own territory. "All right, Marcy," I said with a voice so flat and cold that I even surprised myself. I turned on my heel and started walking up the stairs. Every wooden step creaked under my weight, a familiar sound I'd known since the day I supervised the construction of this house. As I climbed, the dull ache in my left knee tried to remind me of my age, but the adrenaline of sheer fury completely numbed any physical pain. I reached my bedroom and shut the door behind me. The room was cool lit by the morning sun filtering through the blinds. I walked over to the window and looked down at the backyard, at the lemon and orange trees I had planted with my own 2 hands, with soil caked under my fingernails after long shifts selling 100-pound sacks of rice and grain wholesale. I reached into the pocket of my skirt and pulled out my heavy brass key ring. They were weighty, old-school keys, the kind that open heavy steel roll-up doors and industrial lockboxes. The metallic clink of them hitting together snapped me back to the present. I sat on the edge of my bed, smoothing out the quilt with the palm of my hand. I remembered the day Marcy moved back into this house. It was 10 years ago. She showed up crying, dragging cheap suitcases, and 3 kids pregnant with the twins. Her husband, a guy with way more promises than work ethic, had walked out on her for another woman. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, heated up a bowl of soup for her, and told her this would always be her home. I worked double shifts down at the market. I'd get up while the sky was still pitch black. I haggled with the dock workers at the port, fought tooth and nail over wholesale prices, counted crumpled bills and grease-stained coins. All of it so this house would never lack meat on the table, so there would be new shoes every time the school year started, so the medicine cabinet was never empty. When I retired 5 years ago and sold the business, I thought I'd finally get some rest. I thought I'd enjoy my home, my family. But exhaustion and old age have a funny effect on how other people look at you. They make you invisible. Marcy started taking the reins of the house. At first, it was just the little things. She changed the living room curtains without asking me. Then she started deciding the weekly grocery list based entirely on what her kids wanted to eat. Next thing I knew, her book club and wine nights with friends had taken over the patio. I let it happen. I just wanted peace. I figured it was the natural cycle of life, letting the next generation take the wheel. But they mistook my silence for submission and my age for weakness, thinking that just because my hair is white and I walk a little slower, I've lost my mind or my authority. That was her most fatal mistake. Taking my chair, banishing me to my room. That symbolic act was the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was my place in the family, my dignity as the matriarch. They were telling me I was no longer part of the inner circle, that I was a nuisance, a thing to be fed in the shadows so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of their mourning. I stood up from the bed with a surge of energy I hadn't felt since my prime days at the market. I walked over to the massive mahogany wardrobe that dominated one of the bedroom walls. I slid the smallest brass key into the lock on the bottom drawer. The mechanism let out a sharp, solid click. I pulled the drawer open. It smelled of aged wood and mothballs. Tucked beneath some heavy wool sweaters I almost never wear because of the coastal heat, there was a false bottom. I lifted it up. Right there rested my true legacy, my insurance policy against being forgotten and mistreated. I pulled out a yellow folder. The edges were frayed, the cardboard softened by the passage of time. I sat in the armchair by the window and opened it carefully. The scent of old paper and dried ink filled my lungs. It was the smell of my own grit, the perfume of my independence. Inside the folder sat a stack of perfectly organized documents. My hands, marked by age spots and old scars from hauling wooden crates, turned the pages with absolute reverence. First, the property deed, an official document stamped by the county clerk that made it crystal clear, without a shadow of a doubt, that this 2-story house, with its 4 bedrooms, its huge backyard, and its prime frontage on the main avenue, was the sole and exclusive property of Sylvia. There were no early inheritances, no co-owners. The house was mine. Next were the property tax receipts, all paid on time, year after year, straight out of my savings account. The electric bills, the water bills, the high-speed internet bill the boys used all day for their phones and video games. Everything was in my name. Every cent came out of my pocket. But what I was really looking for was tucked into the left flap of the folder, 7 original receipts stapled together, printed on that old carbonless copy paper they hardly use anymore, but which preserves the numbers as if they were typed yesterday. I unclipped the receipts and spread them out on my lap. The first invoice was from 1998 from the big furniture showroom downtown. The description was painfully clear. Red oak dining set, colonial style, 8-foot table, 8 upholstered chairs. At the bottom, the big red paid in full stamp and my signature. That dining set, where they were currently eating like royalty, I bought it with the profits from a killer season of wholesale coffee sales. The second receipt was for the appliances. The double-door French fridge where Marcy kept her groceries. The 6-burner stove where she cooked breakfast this morning. All paid for by me. The third, fourth, and fifth invoices were for the home renovations. The terracotta floors they walked all over with total indifference. The expansion of the kids' bedrooms. The installation of the ceiling fans that kept them cool in the summer heat. The sixth receipt was for the orthopedic mattresses I bought them a couple of years ago because they were whining about back pain. And the seventh receipt, the most recent one, was the payment in full for the flat-screen TVs mounted in every single one of their bedrooms. I stared at those papers for a long time. The printed letters seemed to jump off the page. The sheer amount of money I had invested in the comfort of that family was borderline scandalous. I never charged them a dime. I never asked for rent. I never demanded they chip in for the upkeep of the house. I did it out of love, out of a sense of duty, because a mother doesn't leave her young out in the cold. But love has to be a two-way street, and respect is entirely non-negotiable. Marcy had conveniently forgotten who owned this house. She had convinced herself that she was the lady of the manor, and that I was just some old pensioner living off her charity, someone she could stash away in a back room so I wouldn't get in the way. She had poisoned my grandchildren's minds with that exact same idea, teaching them by example that their grandmother was invisible, irrelevant, just another piece of antique furniture that could be shoved aside whenever they pleased. I ran the pad of my finger over my signature on that first receipt. I felt an immense wave of peace wash over me, that cold, calculating calm that always precedes a perfect storm. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to throw a fit in the kitchen or beg for a chair at my own damn table. This morning's humiliation was exactly the catalyst I needed to wake up from my slumber. They had treated me like a stray dog tossed a scrap of bone on the back porch, but it turned out the dog actually owned the entire estate. I snapped the yellow folder shut. The sound of the thick cardboard smacking together sounded like music to my ears. I gathered the 7 receipts and slipped them into a manila envelope. The initial heartbreak I felt when I saw my chair missing had completely evaporated, replaced by an ironclad resolve. I was going to teach them a brutal lesson in logic and mathematics. If my daughter's logic dictated that there was no room for me in the dining room, my mathematical logic would prove that there was 0 room for them in my finances or on my property under those conditions. I stood up, walked over to the bathroom mirror, and looked at myself. I saw the deep lines around my eyes, the silver hair pulled back into a strict bun. I saw the woman who used to unload freight at dawn, the woman who made a small fortune selling grain by the pound, the woman who built a microscopic but unbreakable empire in this port city. That woman was back. I grabbed my brass keyring again. I squeezed it in my fist until the metal bit sharply into my palm, reminding me that I was very much alive and that I still had absolute control over my destiny. I walked toward my bedroom door, tucking the yellow folder under my arm like it was a shield and a broadsword all at once. I opened the door and heard the laughter drifting up from downstairs. They were having a great time. They had finished breakfast and were probably getting ready to head out, leaving their dirty dishes piled in the sink for the imaginary maid, meaning me, to wash later. I put my foot on the first step. The docile old woman who had walked up these stairs half an hour ago was dead and buried in that bedroom. The woman descending the staircase now was the landlord, ready to collect the back rent on her dignity. I reached the ground floor with heavy, deliberate steps. The dining room was empty of people, but littered with the wreckage of their feast. My chairs were scattered everywhere, pushed back carelessly. On top of the red oak table sat plates smeared with egg yolk, mugs with rings of cold coffee and crumpled up napkins. The terracotta floor was dusted with toast crumbs and sticky spots of spilled orange juice. It looked like the aftermath of a looting. I walked down the hallway toward the backyard, breezing right past the living room. There was Hunter, sprawled out across the three-seater sofa I bought 6 years ago, wearing massive headphones over his ears, his eyes glued to his phone screen. He didn't even blink when I walked past him. It was as if I were completely transparent, a ghost haunting the halls of her own castle. I stepped out onto the patio. The damp, heavy heat of the coast was already hanging thick in the air, but I've always loved it. I sat down in a wicker rocking chair under the shade of the oldest orange tree. I rested the yellow folder on my knees and took a deep breath. The invisibility of old age is a slow-acting poison. You don't even realize you're drinking it until one day you look in the mirror and notice that people don't see a human being anymore. They just see an antique piece of furniture. Back in the market, whenever I walked down the wholesale aisles, the toughest guys on the docks would step aside to let me through. "Mornin', Miss Sylvia," the freight handlers would say, tipping their sweat-stained caps. The suppliers knew damn well you didn't mess with me when it came to the weight of the coffee sacks or the quality of the grain. I was a force of flesh, bone, and absolute authority. But here, under my own roof, I had been erased. My white hair and the slight limp from my left knee had become my cloak of invisibility. Marcy and her kids just saw me as a silent, endless ATM, a machine that paid the utility bills and never required any maintenance. I was partly to blame. I wanted to give them the easy life I never had. I thought unconditional love bought automatic respect. What a terrible businesswoman I was when it came to family matters. I forgot the golden rule of the waterfront. Whatever you give away for free is never valued. I opened the yellow folder again and ran my hand over the paperwork. It was time to take an inventory of my assets and evaluate the competition. My resources were absolute. The deed to the house was in my name, free and clear of any liens or mortgages. My bank account fattened by decades of pre-dawn labor, and the sale of the commercial storefront held more than enough funds to keep me incredibly comfortable until my dying day. My health, despite the usual aches of being 71, was rock solid. My mind was sharp as a butcher's knife, and above all, I had the element of surprise. They honestly believed I was a meek little old lady who was perfectly fine eating in her room. And what were Marcy's resources? My daughter worked part-time at a boutique downtown, a gig that barely covered her expensive skin creams and her iced coffees with the girls. She didn't pay the electric bill, the water bill, or the property taxes. She had no idea what it cost to fill the propane tank or how much the price of beef went up every month. She lived in a delicate glass bubble, blown entirely by my lungs. The grandkids were even more fragile. Hunter, at 19, was a master at video games and completely illiterate when it came to basic responsibilities. The twins and the little girls were mirror images of their mother, used to asking and receiving without ever uttering a single thank you. Their biggest asset was my weakness for them, my grandmotherly instinct. But that instinct had starved to death this very morning, right in front of a cup of coffee they never poured for me. They were morally and financially bankrupt, and they didn't even know it yet. They depended entirely on my infrastructure just to exist. I closed the folder and looked toward the large shed sitting at the back of the yard. I kept it locked with a heavy padlock, the key to which dangled right on my brass ring. That shed was massive, dry, and secure. A good merchant doesn't throw a temper tantrum when a client refuses to pay. They simply cut off the supply chain. If Marcy and her kids wanted to live by the logic that there was no space for me in this house, I was going to apply that exact same logic to them ruthlessly. I would show them that in my house, space, furniture, and comforts are earned, never demanded. My battle plan started mapping itself out in my head with the cold precision of an accountant's ledger. Phase 1 technology. The oxygen of entitled youth is Wi-Fi and television. I paid for the fastest, most expensive fiber optic package in the city just so they wouldn't whine about their games lagging. That was ending today. Phase 2. The furniture. If my red oak table was too small to fit my chair, then the entire table was clearly just in the way. The flat-screen TVs decorating their bedrooms, bought with my hard-earned cash so they could have privacy, were going right back into my inventory. Phase 3. Food and service. I was resigning immediately as the phantom housekeeper of this property. I wasn't going to yell at them. I wasn't going to throw them out on the street right away because that would just make them martyrs in the eyes of the neighbors and themselves. I wanted them to feel the brutal grip of scarcity. I wanted them to experience firsthand what it means to be stripped of your safe haven. I was going to suffocate them with the exact same indifference they had shown me. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket, a simple but highly efficient flip phone, and scrolled through my contacts. The first number I dialed was the cable company. A bored-sounding operator picked up on the third ring. I gave her my info, my account number, and my security PIN. "I need to cancel my internet and cable service immediately," I said, my voice steady as a rock. The operator immediately launched into a script, trying to offer me promotions, discounts, and cheaper bundles. I hit her back with the same icy tone I used to haggle over the price of soybeans in my prime. "I'm not interested in any promotions, ma'am. I want a total, permanent cancellation of service, effective today." "As you wish, Miss Sylvia. The disconnection will reflect in our system in approximately 2 hours." I hung up. That was the first line item crossed off my ledger. Then I searched for another number. Frank had been my most trusted freight loader for 20 years down at the market. A mountain of a man with hands like snow shovels and bulletproof loyalty. Now he ran his own small moving truck business. He answered on the first ring. "Miss Sylvia, what a miracle hearing from you. How can I help the boss?" Frank's gravelly, respectful voice was an absolute balm to my soul. Someone in this world still remembered exactly who I was. "Frank, my boy, I need a massive favor," I said, leaning back into the wicker chair. "Tomorrow, Wednesday, at 10 a.m. sharp, I need you to bring your box truck to my house, along with a couple of guys you trust." "You name it, Miss Sylvia. We move in heavy freight." "We're moving some furniture out of my own house, Frank. My personal property. We're going to load some of it into the backyard shed, and I need you to haul the rest to your storage unit for a while. I need you guys to be fast and quiet. I'll pay double your usual rate." "For you, boss, there is no rate. Tomorrow at 10, I'll be there on the dot with 2 strong guys. Don't you worry about a thing." I hung up and dropped the phone back into my pocket. The gears were officially in motion. I got up from the rocking chair and walked over to the shed. I slid the largest brass key into the padlock. The mechanism, perfectly oiled from my lifelong habit of keeping things in working order, gave way with zero resistance. I pulled open the heavy steel door. Inside it smelled of fine dust and dry cedar. There was plenty of room. Room to store an 8-foot dining table. Room for 8 upholstered chairs. Room for several flat-screen TVs. Plenty of room to teach them exactly what a void feels like. I left the shed door slightly ajar, ready to receive my repossessed merchandise, and walked back inside the house. The vibe in the living room hadn't changed. Hunter was still glued to the couch, laughing at some video on his screen. Right then, I heard Marcy's hurried footsteps coming down the stairs. Her makeup was done, her purse slung over her shoulder, drenched in a sickly sweet perfume that choked the air. She breezed through the kitchen, grabbed her car keys, and finally noticed me standing in the hallway. "Mom, I'm heading to the boutique," she said without even making eye contact, scrolling through something on her phone. "The kids eat it too. I left a 20 on the counter so they can order pizzas. I didn't have time to prep anything. Do me a favor and tidy up the dining room a bit, please. I've got a few girlfriends coming over for coffee this afternoon." She didn't even give me time to nod. She breezed right out the front door, leaving it half-latched, like she always did. I walked over to the kitchen counter. Sure enough, there was a crumpled $20 bill tucked under the salt shaker. Pizza money. I looked at the filthy dining room. The plates crusty with egg, the chairs shoved every which way. My chair was still missing in action, exiled to some dark corner so it wouldn't ruin the vibe. I walked up to the oak table, running my hand along the hand-carved edge, feeling the dense, unyielding grain of the wood. Then I went straight to the sink. I pulled out a heavy-duty black trash bag, the kind you use for yard work. I wasn't going to wash a single plate. I wasn't going to wipe down a single stain. I grabbed the dirty dishes off the table one by one, and without even bothering to scrape the food off, I tossed them straight into the black bag. The ceramic mugs I bought in New York, the silverware caked with grime, the greasy napkins, everything, straight into the garbage bag. I tied a tight blind knot in the thick black plastic and dragged the bag over to the corner of the kitchen. I left it right next to the trash can, but entirely outside of it, in plain sight. The dining room was finally clear. Clean of garbage, but totally stripped bare. I stood dead center in the room, taking in the space they had stolen from me. The silence of the house was only broken by the obnoxious electronic pings coming from Hunter's phone in the living room. Soon, very soon, that noise was going to die out too. I tucked the yellow folder firmly under my arm, feeling the deeply comforting weight of those papers. Every single receipt in there was another nail in the coffin of their entitlement. They had made the fatal mistake of taking the shade of the tree that sheltered them for granted, actually believing they could chop off its branches without suffering the agonizing heat of the sun. I walked back toward the stairs, taking it slow, minding my left knee. But my head was held high, and my chest was swelling with the unbreakable resolve of a merchant who had just unlocked her storefront to collect every single outstanding debt. It was exactly 12:40 in the afternoon when the entire ecosystem of my house collapsed. I was sitting in the rocking chair in my bedroom, mentally auditing the inventory of my strategy, when a guttural howl ripped through the heavy quiet of the upstairs hallway. It wasn't a scream of physical pain. It was the sound of pure, absolute, modern desperation. It kicked me out of the lobby. The Wi-Fi is down. Hunter's voice boomed from the living room, instantly followed by the sound of heavy footsteps taking the stairs two at a time. Almost simultaneously, the doors to the twins' bedrooms slammed open. The digital oxygen had been sucked out of the atmosphere, and my grandkids were stumbling out of their caves like wild animals, disoriented by a forest fire. I heard the frantic knocking on my door. I didn't get up right away. I let their anxiety marinate for a minute, remembering all the times I used to knock on their doors to tell them dinner was ready, only to be completely ignored. I turned the doorknob with agonizing slowness. Hunter was standing right there, white-knuckling his phone, his eyes wide and practically bloodshot from screen glare. "Grandma, the router has a red light on it. You need to call the company and get them to fix it. I was in the middle of a tournament." I looked him up and down. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled t-shirt he had on yesterday. My face stayed as deadpan as a poker player working the riverboat casinos. "There's nothing to fix, kiddo," I answered, my tone soft, almost soothing. "The company cut the service. I imagine it's a permanent cancellation." "What do you mean, permanent? You always pay the bill on the second of the month," one of the twins chimed in, poking his head over his older brother's shoulder. They knew my billing cycle flawlessly, but they couldn't remember my birthday to save their lives. The bitter irony was not lost on me. "Times change, boys. The pension only stretches so far, and we have to cut out the frivolous expenses. Seeing as there's no room for me in the dining room anymore, I figured there wasn't any room in my budget for broadband luxury either. You'll just have to use your cellular data, assuming you have any left." I shut the door right in their faces before they could even formulate a response. I stood behind the solid wood, listening to the chaos unfold. The murmurs of sheer outrage quickly turned into frantic texts to their mother, texts that of course were failing to send because they had zero signal. It was my very first checkmate of the day, and the sound of that cyber silence tasted like pure, unadulterated glory. By 2:30 in the afternoon, real hunger started to overpower the tragedy of the internet outage. From my bedroom window, I watched the two youngest girls playing in the backyard with some old dolls, bored out of their minds without their tablets. Hunter went down to the kitchen, and after a while of opening and shutting drawers and slamming the fridge door, he yelled my name from the bottom of the stairs. I walked down the steps, slowly resting my hand on the banister. Hunter was standing in front of the kitchen counter, holding the crumpled $20 bill Marcy had left under the salt shaker. "Grandma, my mom said to order pizzas. Call the spot downtown. The usual one." I crossed my arms, feeling the heavy weight of my brass keys in my skirt pocket. "My cell phone is prepaid, Hunter, and I haven't added any minutes to it. Besides, I'm nobody's secretary. Your mother left the money for you. Figure it out." "But I don't have internet to look up the number, and I don't have any signal to call," he exploded, throwing his arms up in a gesture of dramatic exasperation. "What are we supposed to do? The girls are starving." "That is the great mystery of adulthood, son," I replied, flashing a half smile. "Back in my day, when you got hungry, you grabbed a couple of eggs, chopped up a tomato and an onion, and made yourself a solid meal. The fridge is full, the stove works just fine, and that $20 bill is plenty to walk down to the corner bakery. It's entirely up to you." I turned my back on him and walked over to the pantry. I pulled out a small can of tuna I had hidden behind the jam jars, a ripe tomato, and a sleeve of saltine crackers. I made my lunch in absolute silence under the stunned gaze of my grandson, who looked like he was watching some incomprehensible magic trick. I took my plate and went out to sit on the patio under the shade of the orange tree. They ended up eating cold cereal straight out of the box because not a single one of those three teenagers had the initiative to turn on a burner. The seed of discomfort had been planted, and it was sprouting fast. At exactly 5 o'clock, the sound of Marcy's car engine announced the next phase of my plan. She wasn't alone. I heard the high-pitched laughter of two of her girlfriends, the jingling of their bracelets and the clicking of their heels on the sidewalk. Marcy was coming in to show off her perfectly sorted life, her spacious house, and her afternoon coffee magically served by the resident ghost. I stayed put in my rocking chair on the patio, where I had a perfect view of the kitchen through the sliding glass door. Marcy walked in acting like the grand hostess. "Come on in, girls. Make yourselves comfortable in the living room. I'll whip up some coffee and those cookies I bought." Her voice cut out abruptly. I watched her entire body tense up as she stepped into the kitchen. Her friends hovered in the doorway, trading confused looks. Marcy walked slowly toward the dining table, which looked massively empty without the placemats, without the silverware, without a single thing on it. Then her eyes traveled toward the corner next to the trash can. Sitting right there was the giant black plastic bag, bulging out, giving off the faint smell of stale food. Marcy pinched the bag open with 2 fingers, leaning in to sniff. All the color drained from her face. And then she flushed a furious, violent red. The plates smeared with egg yolk, the fine ceramic mugs, and the dirty silverware were piled up in there like rubble in a vacant lot. She stormed out onto the patio, leaving her friends completely stranded in the kitchen. She stopped dead in front of my rocking chair, shaking with rage, but keeping her voice down to a hissing whisper so her guests wouldn't hear her screaming. "Mom, what the hell is the meaning of this? Why are the dirty dishes thrown into a garbage bag like we're a bunch of pigs? I asked you to do me a favor and tidy up the dining room." I didn't stop rocking. The sway of the wicker chair was rhythmic, perfectly peaceful. "Ah, yes, you did," I said, adjusting my glasses on the bridge of my nose. "But since you informed me this morning that there's no room for my chair in the dining room, I did some math. If there's no room for me at the table, I figure my old hands don't fit in the sink either. I wash what I dirty, Marcy. The rest of it is merchandise that doesn't belong to me." "I have company, Mom. You are humiliating me in front of my friends," she hissed fiercely, balling her hands into fists. "Humiliation is a dish best served cold, sweetheart," I replied, looking her dead in the eye, with the exact same ice she had used when she banished me to my room hours earlier. "And by the way, the Wi-Fi is out. You're going to have to talk to your friends the old-fashioned way." Marcy gasped for air like I had just gut-punched her. She spun around and marched back into the kitchen. She had to put on rubber gloves right in front of her girlfriends, pull the plates out of the garbage bag one by one, scrape off the crusted food, and wash them in a frantic rush, dying of absolute embarrassment while she stumbled through some awkward lie about a sudden ant infestation. Her friends, clearly uncomfortable, drank a quick glass of water and bolted before 6. The rest of the evening devolved into a Cold War. Marcy screamed at me the second the kids went to bed, accusing me of going senile, of being spiteful, of trying to drive her insane. I just sat on the edge of my bed and listened to her, resting the yellow folder on my lap, gently running my thumb over the cardboard edge. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, "Get some sleep, Marcy. Tomorrow is going to be a very heavy day." And it was. Wednesday dawned with a thick, overcast sky, the kind you get on the coast right before a storm blows in. Marcy rushed out the door to work at 9 a.m., slamming the front door to make sure her anger was felt. The boys were still sleeping, totally exhausted by the lack of digital stimulation. At 10 o'clock sharp, the deep rumble of a diesel engine rattled the glass in the living room windows. I peeked through the blinds. It was Frank's box truck, an absolute beast of a machine with thick wooden side rails and peeling paint. He parked right in front of the walkway. I opened the door before he even had a chance to ring the bell. Frank was standing right there, a mountain of a man in a tank top that showed off arms as thick as tree trunks, flanked by 2 younger guys chewing gum and wearing heavy canvas back braces. "Boss lady at your service," Frank said, pulling off his faded baseball cap as a sign of respect. "You just point the way. Let us know where we start moving the freight." "Come on in, boys. Try to keep the noise down at first. The upstairs merchandise is still asleep." I stepped aside to let the 3 giants walk in. I led them straight to the stairs. My steps were rock solid. The sheer adrenaline of the execution had completely erased any pain in my left knee. "First, stop the kids' bedrooms," I whispered as we reached the upstairs hallway. "I want all the flat-screen TVs. There are 4 in total. Unplug them, wrap them up in those moving blankets you brought, and carry them straight out to the truck. Those are going to your storage unit, Frank." Frank nodded. No questions asked. Dock workers don't question the foreman. They pushed open the door to the twins' room with the stealth of professional cat burglars. The boys were snoring away, tangled up in their sheets. The movers stepped up to the wall, unplugged the cables with surgical precision, and unhooked the massive 50-inch screen from its metal wall mount. The slight metallic scrape woke one of them up. The kid sat bolt upright in bed, rubbing his eyes, totally confused to see two massive strangers in his room walking off with his most prized possession. What are you doing, Grandma? We're getting robbed!" The twins screamed, kicking the blankets off. I stepped into the doorway, my hands neatly folded across my stomach. "Nobody is robbing anything, kid. This is just a routine audit of assets," I said, my voice clear and strictly authoritative. "Keep at it, boys. Let's move on to the girls' room." The girls were awake, but completely paralyzed with fear, watching these massive movers walk in. They huddled into the corner of their bed, while their TV disappeared right out the door. The real confrontation happened in Hunter's room. He was already awake, fuming, because he didn't have internet on his desktop setup. When he saw Frank walk straight toward his curved gaming monitor, he jumped out of his chair. Hey, what is your problem, man? Put my stuff down." Hunter tried to shove one of the helpers, but Frank stepped right in, planting his massive chest like a brick retaining wall. Hunter bounced right off him and froze the second he caught the dock worker's hard stare. "With all due respect, kid, we were hired by the owner of the house." Frank growled, his voice like sandpaper, leaving exactly zero room for argument. "Grandma, tell them to drop my TV. My mom is going to kill you!" Hunter screamed at me, his face red with rage and total helplessness, leaning out into the hallway. "Your mother does not own that screen, Hunter. I financed it for 12 months with zero interest, and I have the receipts sitting right in my bedroom. So technically, I am repossessing my own property. And tell them to grab the gaming chair too, Frank. That thing cost me a pretty penny, and it's ruining my view." Hunter stood there with his mouth hanging open, entirely unable to process the absolute eviction taking place. His entertainment sanctuary was being dismantled right in front of his eyes with military precision. Once all 4 screens and the gaming chair were securely strapped down in the truck, I walked back downstairs. My 5 grandkids were huddled together on the staircase, like a little tribe of castaways, watching the operation in their pajamas, shaking somewhere between pure fury and total disbelief. "Now for the masterpiece, Frank," I said, pointing to the nerve center of the house. "The dining room." Frank and his boys circled the massive red oak table. It was a heavy, solid piece of furniture, built to last for generations. They had to clear the centerpieces off and squat down to lift it from the base. The veins in Frank's neck popped out as the wood finally cleared the terracotta floor. "This one goes straight to the shed in the backyard," I instructed, walking ahead of them to clear the path. The sound of the men's boots shuffling as they carried the table echoed through the entire house. It was the sound of an empire falling. They carried it out through the sliding glass door and into the yard. Then they came back for the chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4. All 8 upholstered chairs vanished through the door, swallowed whole by the gaping metal mouth of the storage shed. I walked over to the brass padlock, slid the heavy shackle into place, and snapped it shut with a loud, definitive, metallic click. I dropped the key back into my pocket. Frank wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. "Job's done, Miss Sylvia. Everything is locked up and secured. The screens are strapped down in the back of the truck." I pulled a wad of bills out of my apron and handed it to him. Frank took it, gave me a deep nod of profound respect, and walked toward the exit with his crew. The diesel engine roared back to life, slowly pulling away down the main avenue. I turned around and walked back inside the house. The space where the red oak dining set used to reign supreme was now just a barren desert of terracotta tiles. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the dust motes floating in the exact spot where they used to sit and ignore me. The house felt massive, naked, echoing. I walked right into the dead center of the void. My footsteps rang out lonely and hollow. I looked over at the stairs. Hunter, the twins, and the girls were still standing there, completely petrified. It was a picture-perfect moment. 5 dethroned heirs staring blankly at the ruins of their entitlement. "So, where are we supposed to eat now?" one of the twins asked, her voice trembling, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. I smoothed out the pleats of my skirt with agonizing slowness, lifted my chin, and looked at them with the ruthless calm of a captain who has just taken absolute control of her ship. The void in that room wasn't a loss. It was the very first installment on a debt that I was just beginning to collect. I looked my granddaughter dead in the eye. Her pale, round face reflected genuine panic, the sheer terror of a generation that has never had to improvise just to survive. The emptiness of the dining room echoed all around us, amplifying the heavy weight of her question. "On the floor, sweetheart," I answered, my voice incredibly soft but entirely unyielding, stripped of any mockery. "Or if you prefer, you can take your plates to your rooms and eat on your beds. After all, that was the brilliant idea your mother had yesterday morning." All 5 of them went dead silent. Hunter balled his hands into fists at his sides, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to say something. He wanted to raise his voice and claim his supposed authority as the older brother. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. He realized, probably for the very first time in his 19 years of life, that authority isn't something you scream. Authority is backed by resources, by sweat equity, and by ownership. And he didn't possess a single one of those 3 things. I turned my back on them with the casual ease of someone taking a Sunday stroll through the park and walked into the kitchen. I mixed a pitcher of lemonade, pulled out a glass, and poured myself a drink slowly. The echo of my own movements in this house, stripped of its massive furniture, was absolutely fascinating to me. It felt like I had finally cleared the overgrown weeds from an abandoned lot, allowing me to see the true foundation of the property again. I took my glass and walked out to the patio, sitting back down in my wicker rocking chair under the orange tree. The afternoon stretched out like a rubber band right before it snaps. No Wi-Fi, no flat-screen TVs to hypnotize them, and no dining table to gather around and demand to be fed. My grandkids looked like ghosts, wandering aimlessly through a maze. From my spot on the patio, I watched them through the glass door. Hunter was pacing back and forth in the living room, staring at the blank wall where his entertainment center used to hang. The twins sat on the hardwood floor with their backs against the kitchen wall, hugging their knees in a graveyard silence. Hunger, that ruthless debt collector that cares absolutely nothing for temper tantrums or bruised egos, finally showed up just past 3 in the afternoon. One of the twins, driven purely by basic survival instinct, peeled herself off the floor and opened the fridge. She pulled out a pack of deli ham, a block of cheese, and a jar of mayo. She dropped them on the kitchen counter. Then she grabbed a loaf of sliced bread. She slapped a sandwich together with clumsy hands, leaving the jar lids scattered everywhere and the ham half unwrapped. When she took her first bite standing up, staring at the massive crater left behind by the red oak table, the tears finally started rolling down her cheeks. It wasn't the crying of deep sadness. It was the pure frustration of total inconvenience. Her siblings slowly followed her lead. They threw together cold food and sat down on the floor in the hallway, eating in absolute silence, struggling to swallow the harsh reality of their brand new existence. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. Down at the waterfront market, I learned that sometimes you have to let the apprentice smash their finger in the scale so they learn to respect the machinery. They were experiencing the very first lesson of their adult lives. Nothing is free, and nobody owes you a damn thing. The wall clock in the kitchen hit 6:15 when I heard Marcy's car engine cut off in front of the house. The sound of her keys jiggling in the front door lock was like the bell ringing for the final round of a heavyweight fight. I took a deep breath, centered the yellow folder on my lap, and braced myself. The coastal breeze blew in warm, rustling the leaves of the orange tree. Marcy pushed the door open hard, talking loudly on her cell phone, complaining about downtown traffic. "Yeah, girl, I'm telling you, the lights were an absolute nightmare. Hang on a second, I'm just walking into the house." The rapid clicking of her heels on the tile stopped dead. The silence that followed was so thick you could chop it with a machete. I watched her silhouette through the glass doors. She dropped her purse right on the floor. The cell phone slipped out of her hand and hit the terracotta with a sharp crack. Her eyes frantically scanned the massive, empty void of the room. No table. No chairs. No centerpieces. Just dead space and the echoing sound of her own panicked breathing. "Hunter girls!" she screamed, her voice completely shredded, laced with absolute terror. "We've been robbed! Call the cops! They cleaned us out!" The kids shuffled out of their bedrooms and dragged themselves down the stairs. They didn't look like the victims of a home invasion. They looked like prisoners of war. "We didn't get robbed, Mom," Hunter said, leaning heavily against the banister with total apathy. "It was Grandma. She brought a moving crew this morning. They took the dining set, the TVs, out of our rooms, and even my gaming chair. And the internet's cut, too." Marcy blinked a few times, trying to process the data. Her face went from ghost-white shock to the deep, burning red of entirely unchecked fury. She spun on her heels, locked eyes with the sliding glass door leading to the patio, and found me, sitting right there in my rocking chair, swaying back and forth with agonizing slowness. She burst out onto the patio like a Category 5 hurricane. Her footsteps were heavy, aggressive. She stopped 3 feet away from me, her fists clenched tight, the veins in her neck bulging. "You are out of your mind. You have gone completely insane, Mom," she roared, practically spitting the words. "How dare you take the furniture out of my house? What kind of sick, twisted punishment is this? You put my things back right now, or I swear to God I will have you locked up in a home for senile dementia." I stopped the rocker, planting my shoes firmly on the concrete patio. I took a solid second to look at her bloodshot eyes, her aggressive stance, her totally intact arrogance. "Lower your voice, Marcy. The neighbors don't need to hear about your utter lack of resources," I said, using the coldest, most controlled voice I could physically produce. "And before you keep spitting out threats you have absolutely no power to back up, I strongly suggest you watch your mouth, because you are about to find out that you do not have the power, the money, or the authority to send me anywhere." "It is my house. That's my stuff. Those are my kids' TVs," she screamed, though her voice wavered just a fraction when she realized I wasn't even slightly afraid of her. I stood up from the rocking chair slowly. Even at 71, I still had a good 3 inches on her, and decades of hauling heavy freight had given me a broad, commanding build. I picked up the yellow folder from my lap and unwound the string, keeping it shut. "That right there is your fundamental problem, Marcy. Your logic is rotten straight down to the roots," I said, opening the folder and pulling out the documents with surgical precision. "You have lived in the illusion of your own comfort for so long that you actually bought into the fairy tale that you were the captain of this ship just because I let you play pretend." I pulled out the first document. The heavy paper crinkled with a sharp snap. "Read this," I ordered, shoving the property deed right in front of her face. Marcy took a half step back, totally disoriented. Her eyes darted down to the official county paper, covered in notary seals and signatures. "It's the deed to the house," she whispered, her brow furrowing. "Exactly. And if you know how to read, you'll see that the only name listed under property owner is Sylvia. This house, from the concrete foundation up to the roof, where I pay to fix the leaks every spring, is mine. Not yours, mine. You are a guest who has severely overstayed her welcome." Marcy swallowed hard. The furious red in her face started draining away, replaced by an ashen, sickly pale. She tried to claw back some lost ground, lifting her chin. "I'm your daughter. This is my inheritance. It's the exact same thing." I let out a short, joyless laugh, a harsh, grating sound that made her flinch. "Inheritances are handed out when the dead stop breathing, sweetheart. And as you can clearly see, my lungs are working just fine. So as long as my heart is beating, this isn't an inheritance. It's my capital." I pulled the manila envelope out of the left pocket of the folder and slid out the 7 original carbon copy receipts. I held them up high like a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. "Yesterday morning you took my chair. You said there was no room for me in the dining room. Your logic was truly brilliant. Stash the old lady away in the back room so she doesn't ruin the aesthetic of your breakfast. But you made an unforgivable miscalculation for anyone in the business world. You completely forgot to verify who actually owned the merchandise." I unfolded the first receipt and held it right at her eye level. "Red oak dining table, 8 feet long, 8 upholstered chairs, invoiced to Sylvia, paid in full with cash. That dining set is mine." I unfolded the next one. 4 high-definition flat-screen TVs, financed for 12 months with 0 interest on Sylvia's credit card. They are mine. I kept flipping through the papers, one by one, flicking them sharply with the back of my hand so the snapping sound emphasized every single word. "The refrigerator, the stove, the mattresses your kids sleep on, the high-speed internet service that I just permanently canceled. Everything is in my name. Every single dime comes out of my pocket. You work part-time at a boutique downtown, and you barely pull in enough to cover your skin creams and your iced coffees." Marcy kept backing up, step by step, physically crushed under the overwhelming weight of the evidence. The patio had gone dead silent. My 5 grandkids were huddled together behind the sliding glass door, listening to every single word, watching their mother's armor of authority dissolve like a sugar cube in boiling water. "I opened the doors of my home to you 10 years ago when you showed up crying with cheap luggage and not a single dollar to your name." I continued lowering the papers, but keeping my eyes locked dead on hers. "I gave you a roof, food security. I gave you a safe space to raise your kids without the agonizing panic of not knowing how you were going to feed them dinner. And in return, what did I get? I got erased. You turned me into the resident ghost who pays the bills, the maid who washes the dirty dishes you leave scattered across my own damn table." "Mom, that wasn't my intention," Marcy stammered. The arrogance was completely gone. Her shoulders slumped and her hands literally started shaking. "Do not interrupt me," I snapped with a tone so sharp it made her physically shrink. "Yesterday you taught me your logic. Today I am teaching you mine. If in my own house, at the table that I bought with my own sweat, there is no room for me to sit down and drink a cup of coffee, then there is no table for anybody. The rules of the game have officially changed, Marcy." I reached into my skirt pocket and pulled out my brass keyring. I shook it right in front of her face. The heavy, metallic clinking sounded like a funeral bell. Right here are the keys to the padlock on the storage shed where the dining set is currently resting. Frank hauled the TVs off to his warehouse. My assets are fully secured. And now I am going to give you the brand new terms and conditions for your continued stay on my property. Marcy just stared at me, her eyes wide open, brimming with tears she was desperately trying to hold back. The sheer panic of being entirely unprotected had paralyzed her. The kids behind the glass looked like statues. Condition number 1, I said, holding up a single finger. Starting the 1st of next month, you are going to pay me rent to live here. You will run the numbers and hand over 20% of your paycheck. It's not a lot, but it's a start, so you finally understand exactly what a roof costs. I held up a second finger. Condition number 2. The electric, water, and gas bills will be split right down the middle. If you can't afford it, I highly suggest you start turning off the lights when you leave a room and get used to taking cold showers. The internet is a luxury. If Hunter and the rest of them want it back, they're going to have to go out, find weekend jobs, and pay for it themselves. I do not finance dead weight. I held up a third finger. Condition number 3. I am never washing another dish, sweeping another hallway, or cooking for this entire infantry ever again unless I genuinely feel the desire in my heart to do so. The household chores are going to be split evenly among your 5 kids. They have healthy hands and feet. If I wake up and the kitchen is a mess, the food in the fridge goes straight into the trash. Marcy openly sobbed. She buried her face in her hands, completely defeated. The house of cards where she had been playing queen had collapsed under the weight of a few old receipts and a heavy dose of brutal reality. And finally, I added, taking a step forward until I was just inches away from her, the respect for me in this house will be absolute. I am the matriarch of this family. I am the sole provider of this infrastructure. And I am the legal owner of these walls. If I hear one more disrespectful comment, if I ever catch you ignoring me again, or if anybody ever sends me to my room to eat, I will use these brass keys to lock the front door from the outside. I will sell this property in less than 30 days. I will move into a beachfront hotel and live out my golden years like absolute royalty. And every single one of you will have to find shelter out on the street. Silence fell over the patio again, broken only by my daughter's muffled crying. I looked over at the glass door. Hunter had his head down, staring at his sneakers. The twins were crying quietly, holding on to each other. The little girls looked terrified, but entirely focused. They had just witnessed the most brutal, clean transfer of power in their short lives. They had watched the false queen fall, and for the very first time, they recognized the true owner of the territory. I didn't hug Marcy. I didn't offer her any words of comfort. That blind, all-forgiving affection was the exact poison that had dragged us down into this mess. Down at the port, when a debtor finally admits they're bankrupt, you don't give them a hug. You give them a payment plan, and you send them to work. I turned around, slid the receipts back into the yellow folder, and tucked it under my arm. I walked toward the sliding glass door. My grandkids scrambled out of the way, immediately parting like the Red Sea, with clumsy urgency keeping their eyes glued to the floor in a gesture of absolute submission. A respect born entirely out of terror, but one that I hoped with time to forge into genuine gratitude. I stepped inside the house and walked down the hardwood hallway. The emptiness of the dining room didn't feel desolate to me anymore. On the contrary, it looked like a completely blank canvas. The rules had been laid down, and the debts were officially on the table. The marketplace of dignity had reopened for business, and I had just set the brand new market price. The first month, after what is now whispered about in this house as the day of the foreclosure, was an absolute endurance test. The quiet that settled into the walls wasn't the silence of disrespect anymore. It was the silence of extreme caution. The entire house seemed to hold its breath whenever I walked down the hall. My footsteps on the terracotta floor beat the drum for a brand new era, one where my invisibility had been permanently banished at the point of carbon copy receipts and brass keys. For the first 2 weeks, absolute chaos reigned in the kitchen. I would sit in my wicker rocker under the orange tree with my glass of lemonade, watching through the sliding doors as the delicate glass bubble my daughter and grandkids lived in finally shattered into a million pieces. I watched Marcy burn 3 separate batches of rice before she figured out that you actually have to monitor the heat on a stove. I watched the twins cry at the sink because the dish soap was drying out their hands. I watched Hunter fight a losing battle with the broom, just pushing dirt from one side of the room to the other without actually sweeping it into the dustpan, cursing under his breath. I didn't step in a single time. My maternal grandmotherly instincts clawed at my gut, begging me to get up, snatch the rag out of their hands, and just fix their lives the way I always had. But then I remembered my missing chair. I remembered the plastic tray with the scraps of my own breakfast. I swallowed my pity and kept my mouth shut. Down at the waterfront market, if you forgive a client's debt out of pity, the very next day you'll have 10 more guys lined up demanding the exact same treatment. Love that doesn't demand effort only breeds parasites, and I flat out refuse to leave behind a legacy of useless people. The first real sign that the soil was starting to yield a crop happened on the first day of the following month. I was in my bedroom balancing my accounts in a spiral notebook when I heard 2 timid knocks on my door. It was a completely new sound. Before, they would just barge right in or yell for me from the hallway. "Come in," I said, snapping the notebook shut. Marcy walked in slowly. She was wearing her uniform from the boutique, but her eyes had a totally different look to them. A mix of genuine exhaustion and total resignation. She stood right in front of me, gripping a white paper envelope tightly in her hands. She didn't try to sit on my bed or invade my space. "Mom?" She started, her voice a little raspy. "I got paid today. I ran the numbers like you asked. Here is 20% of my paycheck and exactly half of the electric bill that came in on Tuesday." She reached out and set the envelope down on my nightstand. I looked at her in silence for a few seconds. Her nails didn't have that expensive manicure she usually sported. They were clipped short and clean. She had stopped ordering takeout and had started taking Tupperware containers of her own cooking to work. "Take a seat, Marcy," I said, pointing to the small armchair by the window. She obeyed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It wasn't easy, was it?" I asked, resting my forearms on my knees. "I had to cancel the department store credit card," she admitted, staring at the floor. "And the girls complained all week because I cut out the name brand snacks and just bought sweetbread from the corner bakery. They kind of hate me right now." I let out a soft laugh. It was the first genuinely kind sound I had directed at her in 30 days. "They don't hate you, sweetheart. They're testing you. They're walking the fence line looking for a weak spot so they can get back to grazing without putting in the work. If you cave now, by next month, you'll be drowning in debt all over again. You don't buy respect by handing them everything they demand. You earn it by proving that the boat isn't going to sink because you're the one steering the ship." Marcy looked up. There were tears pooling in her eyes, but she didn't let a single one fall. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mom, for the envelope, and for not throwing us out on the street that day." "The street is for people who are beyond saving, Marcy. You were just resting on your laurels." Now go get some sleep. Tomorrow is your day to scrub the bathrooms." She walked out of my room with her spine a little straighter. I picked up the white envelope, counted the cash, and locked it in my safe. I didn't need that money to survive, but she desperately needed to hand it over in order to learn how to survive. Hunter's case was a lot rougher. By the middle of the third week, internet withdrawals had him practically climbing the walls. One afternoon, he ambushed me in the hallway, blocking my path with his 6-foot frame. "Grandma, I'll power wash the patio. I'll clean the windows. I'll do whatever you want. Just please pay for 1 month of Wi-Fi. I'm losing my mind." I looked him up and down. He was wearing a clean shirt, a massive achievement considering his previous habits, but his attitude was still that of an entitled beggar. "I sweep my own patio, Hunter, and I prefer to clean my windows my own way," I told him, gently pushing him aside with my arm. "If you want cash, go find someone who actually needs your hands. Down at the port, they're always short on guys to haul freight. Go ask for Frank. Tell him I sent you." I figured he'd be highly offended that he'd spin around, lock himself in his room, and curse my name. But sheer boredom is a ruthless teacher. The next morning at 5 a.m., I heard the front door open and click shut. He came back at 3 in the afternoon. He smelled like raw fish, stale sweat, and diesel fuel. His hands were bright red and blistered, and his t-shirt was plastered to his chest. He walked straight into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and chugged half a liter of water straight from the pitcher without me saying a word. Then he looked over at me, totally dead on his feet, but with a spark of wild, fierce pride in his eyes. "Frank says he needs me back at 4:30 tomorrow morning to unload the onion trucks," he said, panting slightly. "Onions stain your hands and make you cry, boy. Scrub up good with a bar of heavy soap before you go to sleep." That was all I said to him. By the end of that month, Hunter went out and bought a mobile hotspot router with his own hard-earned cash. He plugged it in the living room and charged his siblings a weekly subscription fee just to give them the password. He had officially become a merchant. He finally understood the true value of the merchandise. I just smiled from my rocking chair, watching him protect his investment tooth and nail, completely cutting the twins off the network the day they refused to wash their dishes. The total transformation of the house wasn't magical. It was entirely mechanical. Like an old pocket watch getting wound up after gathering dust for years. The gears ground together clumsily at first, but eventually they found their rhythm. The little girls learned to pick up their toys without being asked, terrified that Grandma would call the men with the big truck to come haul them away. The twins figured out that ironing their own school uniforms saved them from their mother's wrath, but the void in the dining room was still there, massive and totally silent. For 45 days, the family ate standing at the kitchen counter, taking turns or sitting on the living room sofa. The massive crater in the terracotta floor was a constant daily reminder of the rules of the game. Until the second Sunday of the second month. I woke up at 6 in the morning. The air was crisp, and the coastal sky had that deep violet color that promised a crystal-clear day. I walked into the kitchen to brew my black coffee. The house was absolutely spotless. The sink was shining entirely free of dirty dishes. Hunter had taken the trash out to the curb the night before. The smell of bleach-cleaned surfaces and hard work hung in the air. They had paid their debt with interest. They had finally learned to look past their own damn belly buttons. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed the number I already knew by heart. "Frank, good morning, my boy." "Morning, boss lady. You name it. What are we moving today?" "I need you to bring the truck by at 10 o'clock sharp. We're going to pull the dining set out of the shed and put it right back where it belongs. The TVs stay in your storage unit until December. If the boys are still holding down jobs by then, maybe I'll sell them back to them." "Whatever you say, Miss Sylvia. I'll be there at 10 on the dot." Right around noon, the heavy thud of Frank and his crew's boots echoed through the house. Marcy and the kids, who were hanging out in the living room, jumped up in an absolute panic, thinking a second wave of repossessions was happening. They huddled together in the hallway, their eyes wide, watching the men carry the massive red oak table in from the backyard and drop it perfectly dead center in the room. Then they brought in the upholstered chairs one by one. The sound of the heavy wood settling against the terracotta tile felt exactly like a heartbeat coming back to life. "All set, boss. Everything's right where it belongs," Frank said, wiping his hands on his denim jeans. "Looks good as new." I paid him for his time, handed him a very generous tip, and walked him to the door. When I shut the front door and turned back to face the house, I found my entire family standing in a circle around the table, terrified to even touch it. They looked like tourists admiring an untouchable monument. I walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. My brass keys jingled in my pocket, a sound that now commanded their deepest, most absolute respect. I walked straight to the head of the table, the spot by the window, the one that caught the ocean breeze. I rested my hand on the back of the chair. "The table has returned because I have decided to offer you a seat under my roof," I said, locking eyes with every single one of them from the tallest down to the smallest. "Space in this house is never demanded, it is earned. And you have all proven that you know exactly how to earn it." Marcy slapped a hand over her mouth, choking back a heavy sob of pure relief. Hunter nodded his head with a deep, grounded seriousness I had never seen in him before he started hauling heavy freight down at the docks. "Marcy, go into the kitchen and heat up that pot roast you learned how to make last week," I ordered, my voice gentle. "Hunter, set the plates and the silverware. Girls, grab the napkins and the glasses. Today, we eat like a family." The explosion of movement was instantaneous. It was a flawless choreography of pure gratitude. Nobody complained. Nobody dragged their feet. In less than 30 minutes, the smell of roasted beef, onions, and carrots completely flooded the house, scrubbing any lingering bitterness right out of the air. When the center of the table was loaded up with the steaming pot, the warm bread, and the pitchers of ice water, I stepped up to my spot. I didn't even have to pull my chair out. Hunter stepped right up, grabbed the heavy red oak backrest, and slid it out for me. "Have a seat, Grandma," he said, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered, but speaking with the steady voice of a young man who finally understands his place in the world. I sat down. The wood molded to my back with the deep familiarity of an old embrace. Hunter pushed the chair in gently until I was at the perfect distance from the table. Then every single one of them took their assigned seats. Marcy grabbed the ladle and served the very first bowl of stew, making sure to scoop up the most tender cuts of beef and the best-cooked vegetables. She didn't hand it to her kids. She walked it straight over to my spot and set it down in front of me. Then she grabbed the ceramic mug, filled it to the brim with steaming black coffee, and placed it right next to my right hand. "Enjoy your meal, Mom," she said, her voice heavy with a profound, genuine reverence. "Enjoy your meal, family," I replied. Only then did the rest of them start passing the food. The clinking of spoons against the ceramic bowls filled the room. The coastal breeze blew in through the open window, brushing against my face, carrying the heavy scent of salt and open water. We ate in total peace. They talked about their days, their small victories, and their deep exhaustion. I just listened, only chiming in when they specifically asked for my advice. I wasn't the invisible old woman ruining the aesthetic of their modern lives anymore. I was the matriarch, the owner of the capital and the wisdom, the woman who had built this sanctuary with her own bare hands and who had been perfectly willing to burn it straight to the ground just to save them from their own blinding arrogance. Society tries incredibly hard to tell us women with white hair that our time is officially up. They demand that we step aside. that we shrink ourselves down until we fit into some dark corner, that we hand over the keys to our kingdom in exchange for a few conditional crumbs of affection. They want us sweet, docile, quiet. They want us sitting in the back bedroom eating scraps off a plastic tray. But I am Sylvia. I was a wholesale merchant. I went toe to toe with dock workers, and I built my entire estate dollar by dollar in the absolute blazing hell of the waterfront market. My skin might be wrinkled, and my left knee might betray me on cold mornings, but my willpower is forged out of solid iron. That afternoon, when we finished eating, I didn't lift a single finger to clear the table. Hunter and the twins took care of clearing the plates and washing the dishes. Marcy swept the dining room floor. I just stood up. I walked slowly toward the stairs and climbed up to my bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer of my mahogany wardrobe. I slid the small key in, popped up the false bottom, and looked down at the yellow folder resting right there. The property deed and the receipts were exactly where they belonged, untouched, waiting like a silent army in the dark, just in case they were ever called upon again. I ran my fingertips over the worn cardboard. I didn't need to pull it out. True power isn't the kind you have to scream about every single day. True power is the kind everyone else knows you possess, and they are perfectly willing to respect it without you ever having to prove it. I shut the false compartment. I turned the key, pulled it out, and dropped it into my skirt pocket right next to the heavy brass ring. I walked over to my bedroom window and looked down at the backyard glowing in the late afternoon sun. The orange tree was still standing right there, its deep roots dug firmly into the soil that I bought and paid for, casting its long shade over a family that had finally learned exactly how to honor its oldest branch. Reflecting on Sylvia's powerful journey, I am struck by how easily we take our life foundations for granted. Her missing red oak chair wasn't just furniture. It represented her heartbreaking erasure from the family. This narrative proves that genuine love must always be balanced with unwavering mutual respect. Providing unconditional comfort often breeds a toxic entitlement that blinds loved ones to our daily sacrifices. I deeply believe the greatest humanistic lesson here is that establishing firm boundaries is a wonderfully necessary act of profound love. By removing the dining table and televisions, Sylvia forced them to genuinely experience the void of her absence. True appreciation blossoms only when the flow of freely given, unearned resources suddenly stops. As valued listeners, please always remember that you must never shrink your beautiful presence to accommodate someone else's blind arrogance. It is incredibly vital to recognize those quiet pillars whose invisible labor keeps our daily lives completely secure and stable. True authority is not loudly demanded, but earned through sweat equity, personal responsibility, and consistent action. Aging should absolutely never render a person invisible or irrelevant in the eyes of their loved ones. Like Sylvia, we must fiercely protect our self-worth and refuse the unacceptable scraps left on a plastic tray. Restoring that heavy dining table was about intentionally offering a hard-earned seat of mutual gratitude. Forgiving without accountability enables harm, while demanding responsibility builds capable, resilient humans. Let this story inspire you to confidently stand your ground and consciously build relationships anchored in unshakable appreciation. Disclaimer: the views expressed in this audio program are purely personal perspectives and do not constitute professional advice.